Beneath the cobblestone streets of Salem, hidden for centuries in a forgotten chamber, a discovery was made that threatened to rewrite history. Among the dust and decayed timber, authorities uncovered a collection of documents, ledgers, journals, and scraps of parchment that revealed a story too disturbing for the official record. These were not the scribbles of superstition or the ramblings of fearful villagers. They were precise, methodical, cold, and they all bore the same name, Blackwell. To most. The Salem witch trials remain one of America's most infamous miscarriages. Of justice a dark chapter where fear and hysteria condemned innocent lives. But what if I told you that hysteria was only the mask? That behind the public panic lurked a family who turned suspicion into a weapon, fear into currency, and executions into opportunity. The Blackwell brothers Ezekiel, Nathaniel, and Josiah were not simply figures of authority in colonial Massachusetts. They were architects of something far more sinister. As judge, reverend, and sheriff, they held power over every aspect of their community law, faith, and punishment. And they used that power with chilling precision. What history remembers as 19 executions may in truth have been closer to 237 each. Name, each life, each family was carefully documented in what became known as the Blackwell. Ledger, a book of secrets hidden beneath floorboards and guarded with blood. Notations beside the victims' names told a different story than the one preached from the pulpit or recorded in court records. Acquisition complete, matter resolved, disposed of quietly. These were not the words of frightened colonists battling the devil. They were the coded language of calculated theft and systematic murder. But perhaps the most disturbing detail lies not in what the brothers did, but in what they left behind. To this day, Blackwell descendants still own swaths of Salem's historic district land first seized under the shadow of witchcraft accusations, wealth built on graves hidden beneath pine and swamp soil. And then there is Mercy Blackwell, the young niece who kept the records, the girl who saw too much, a figure erased from official history, yet whispered of in recovered journals. Did she betray her family, or did her family silence her forever? Some say her ghost still walks the oldest meeting house in Salem, clutching scraps of parchment that no fire could consume. This story is not for the faint of heart. It is not the tale of spectral visions or curses whispered in the night. It is the story of how greed wore the mask of godliness, and how three brothers used the fear of witches to build a dynasty of blood. If you're brave enough to continue, join me as we unearth the macabre history of the Blackwell family. But be warned, once you see how deep their influence runs, you may never look at the Salem witch trials. The same way again, Salem in the late 17th century was a fragile settlement clinging to survival on the edge of the wilderness. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was harsh, unforgiving, its winters long, its soil stubborn, its forests dense and filled with unseen threats. For the Puritans who called this place home, order and faith were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Every aspect of daily life revolved around discipline, conformity, and obedience to God. To question authority was to risk not only social ruin, but eternal damnation. And at the very center of this community stood the Blackwell family. The Blackwells were not just respected, they were feared, admired, envied, and obeyed. Their rise to dominance was not sudden, but by 1692, their influence was absolute. Three brothers, each occupying a position of authority that on its own would have made any man powerful, but together gave them near total control over Salem's spiritual, judicial, and physical life. The eldest, Judge Ezekiel Blackwell at 46, presided over the local courts. He was a man whose very presence carried weight. With his severe black attire and piercing eyes that seemed to strip away the pretense of anyone who stood before him, Ezekiel's rulings were considered as final, as scripture. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were sharp and deliberate, as though carved into stone. Though outwardly modest, eschewing jewelry and finery in accordance with Puritan ideals, Ezekiel was quietly amassing vast wealth and political capital, always behind closed doors. His brother, Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell, was the voice of fire and brimstone that shook the rafters of the meeting house each Sunday. Gaunt, pale, and with a stare that made parishioners tremble. Nathaniel was known for sermons that stretched long into the evening, his voice climbing from whispers of damnation to roars of divine judgment. Many believed he could peer directly into the soul, detecting impurity with a single glance. He wielded Scripture like a weapon, his authority unquestioned. His word equated with God's will itself. The youngest, Sheriff Josiah Blackwell, embodied brute force. A man built like an ox, with a permanent scowl carved into his face. Josiah patrolled Salem with a distinctive carved walking stick in hand, a stick that was whispered to have broken more bones than any weapon in the county. He enforced not only the colony's laws, but also the will of his brothers. His presence at a door in the dead of night was often the last a villager saw. Before being dragged away in chains, together, the brothers created a triangle of power unlike any other. In the colony, law, faith, and enforcement all flowing through a single family name. But how does a family acquire such dominance in a settlement where suspicion and envy ran high? The answer lay not only in their positions, but in their unity. The Blackwells never acted alone. They spoke in one voice, reinforced one another's authority, and silenced any opposition through coordinated force. In Salem, challenging one Blackwell was to challenge them all, and that was a battle no villager dared to fight. Their home stood as a symbol of this influence. Directly across from the meeting house rose a stately two-story structure with rare glass windows that gleamed in the sun. While Puritan modesty dictated simplicity, the Blackwell residents spoke quietly of privilege. Behind its doors, secrets were kept, deals were struck, and futures were decided. It was here that the brothers gathered late into the night, their discussions carried out in hushed tones but with far-reaching consequences. Yet beneath their outward piety, the Blackwells faced a problem. Salem was changing. New merchants were arriving, establishing businesses that threatened the brothers' trading interests. Families like the Putnams and the Proctors were rising in influence, challenging the Blackwells' grip on commerce and land. Rivals began to circle, sensing opportunity in the cracks of the brothers. Dominance. It was in this environment of tension and quiet desperation that the Blackwells recognized the power of fear. Fear could silence rivals. Fear could unite a community under their control. And fear could open doors to wealth that ordinary transactions could never achieve. The timing could not have been more perfect. The winter of 1691 was unusually harsh. Crops failed, illness spread, and survival itself became precarious. Whispers of witchcraft, once confined to fearful mutterings, now carried weight. Strange fits among young girls, livestock dying unexpectedly, tools breaking without cause, signs that the devil had found his way into Salem, and who better to protect the community from this invisible enemy than the Blackwells? Judge Ezekiel to oversee the trials, Reverend Nathaniel to provide divine justification, Sheriff Josiah to drag the accused from their homes. Their roles aligned seamlessly with the growing hysteria, transforming vague suspicion into an organized campaign. It is here that their dynasty truly began, not through open warfare or rebellion, but through a conspiracy cloaked in righteousness. Each accusation of witchcraft brought with it not only the removal of an enemy, but an opportunity. Land, mills, farms, riverside property assets that passed from the accused into the hands of the Blackwells under the guise of justice. But this is only the surface. The official story tells of 19 executions. The deeper truth, recorded in secret ledgers and whispered in hidden chambers, reveals a far darker reality. The rise of the Blackwell dynasty was not an accident of history. It was by design, a calculated manipulation of fear and faith. A sinister tale that began in the meeting house and bled into every home in Salem, and at its heart, a young woman named Mercy Blackwell, whose quiet eyes saw more than her family ever intended. The rise was only the beginning. The descent into darkness was yet to come. By the spring of 1692, Salem was already a community on edge. The long winter had left its mark fields barren, families hungry, and tempers frayed. What began as whispers of unexplained illness and strange visions quickly escalated into something darker. Children convulsed, neighbors accused neighbors, and fear became the colony's new currency. But in the chaos, one family recognized an opportunity. The Blackwells understood what others did not. Fear could be shaped, directed, and wielded like a blade. It could destroy rivals, elevate allies, and secure power that no amount of trade or land deals could buy. Judge Ezekiel Blackwell took the lead. As accusations began to multiply, he ensured they were formalized into law. Testimonies of spectral evidence, visions, dreams, unseen torments were given legal weight under his gavel. To question their validity was to question Ezekiel himself, and by extension, the very authority of God's chosen court. He transformed rumor into decree, turning Salem's panic into a judicial machine. From the pulpit, Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell fanned the flames. His sermons thundered with images of hellfire and demonic plots festering within Salem's very walls. He warned that witches were not outsiders, but neighbors, those seated in the pew beside you, those breaking bread at your table. Every nod of his head, every pause before a name, sowed suspicion like seeds in fertile soil. Congregants left the meeting house trembling, convinced that Satan's hand was moving among them. And then came Sheriff Josiah Blackwell, who made those fears flesh. By night, he and his men would storm homes, dragging the accused from their beds, iron shackles, rough hands, the echo of boots on wooden floors. These were the sounds that haunted Salem's nights. Josiah relished his role, his reputation as the colony's iron fist only growing as more and more were hauled to the jail on his orders. Each accusation followed a pattern. Those named were seldom the destitute or powerless. What gain would there be in seizing their meager scraps? Instead, suspicion conveniently fell upon prosperous merchants, landowners, or widows whose property stood unprotected. Once condemned, their assets became forfeit. Mills, orchards, farmland, even shipping routes all quietly absorbed into the Blackwell estate, and the community, blinded by terror, applauded the very theft disguised as righteousness. It was a perfect system. Fear supplied the accusations. Law legitimized them, the pulpit sanctified them, and the sheriff enforced them. Together, the Blackwells transformed Salem's hysteria into a weapon more powerful than sword or musket. Yet within the family's triumph lay a growing unease. Their young cousin, Mercy Blackwell, saw what others refused to. She watched as friends vanished, neighbors stripped of dignity, lives erased with ink on a page. For every land deed signed, for every public hanging cheered, she recorded the truth. Her quiet rebellion, her determination to preserve the evidence of her family's crimes, would become the crack in their seemingly unshakable armor. The witchcraft panic was no accident of superstition. It was a strategy. A weapon forged in fear, sharpened by greed, and wielded without mercy. For years, whispers circulated in Salem of a hidden book, a record not of prayers or sermons, but of lives extinguished and fortunes stolen. Some called it myth. Others swore they had glimpsed its pages ink black as tar, margins stained by hands that did not tremble when signing away another human soul. This was the Blackwell Ledger. Its existence first surfaced in late 1692 during a routine inspection of court records. Colonial officials expected to find the usual petitions and decrees, but instead they stumbled upon a small, leather-bound volume tucked deliberately out of sight. Its cover bore no title, only deep scratches as though someone had tried to erase its identity. Inside, however, the truth was undeniable. Every page carried names. Not the 19 Salem officially remembers, but hundreds more, 237 in all. Each line bore chilling notations, execution dates, confiscated properties, valuations neatly totaled in the margins. And beside many entries, a phrase repeated with mechanical precision: acquisition complete. This was not a court document. It was an inventory. The authors were unmistakable. Signatures in the margins: Eb for Ezekiel, MB for Nathaniel, JB for Josiah marked, who had overseen each transaction. A judge's ruling here, a preacher's condemnation there, a sheriff's warrant to seal the victim's fate. Together, they had turned Salem into a ledger of profit. Each human life converted into acreage, coin, or influence. One passage was especially disturbing. It detailed the division of a widow's property down to her silverware, with a note from Sheriff Josiah, resolved swiftly, resistance minimal. Their casual tone stripped away any illusion of justice. These were not trials, they were seizures cloaked in scripture, but the most haunting detail was not the writing. It was the evidence of what had once been pressed between the pages. Forensic examination centuries later revealed faint traces of dried blood absorbed into the parchment's fibers. Whether it belonged to the victims or to those who dared to resist, no one can say, but it gave the ledger a name whispered ever since. The Book of Blood. When news of its discovery reached the governor's office, panic spread not among the accused, but among the Blackwells themselves. That very night, Ezekiel and Josiah vanished. From Salem, their loyal deputies scattering into the countryside. Rumors claimed they fled south with sacks of silver and deeds hidden in barrels of grain. Others whispered of ships seen departing for the Caribbean under false names. The ledger should have ended their dynasty. Instead, it became the foundation of their myth. Suppressed by officials eager to bury the shame of the trials, it was quietly locked away, whispered about but never studied in public. Families of the missing were told their loved ones had fled, while the Blackwells' wealth only grew, yet the ledger survived. Passed in secret, resurfacing in fragments, it continues to cast its shadow across centuries. Each page is not only evidence of greed, but a reminder that history's darkest crimes often hide in plain sight, disguised as law, sanctified by faith, and sealed with blood. In the end, the downfall of the Blackwells did not come from their enemies. It came from within. By 1692, the family had amassed power through fear, deception, and blood. But power is a double-edged sword, and the Blackwells were as skilled at turning it against one another as they were at wielding it against Salem. Behind closed doors, their unity cracked, envy festered, greed outgrew loyalty. And when suspicion spread like wildfire through the town, the Blackwells began to suspect each other more than their accusers. The betrayal that shattered them began with whispers about a girl, Mercy Blackwell. Young, intelligent, and observant, she had long been treated as an ornament in the family schemes, hidden from public view but privy to their most guarded secrets. Mercy knew of the ledger. She knew of the graves beneath the meeting house. And most dangerously, she knew the truth that Salem's hysteria was no accident. It was engineered by her own blood. At first, she stayed silent. But as the noose tightened around the town and she watched innocent neighbors condemned, Mercy began recording her thoughts in a private journal. Her words reveal a soul torn between fear and justice. In one surviving passage, she wrote, "I cannot remain complicit. Their power is a lie spun of terror, and I see now the devil they claim to fight is in their own hearts." It was William Blackwell, her cousin, who made the fateful choice. Historians believe he was the one who carried Mercy's writings, or perhaps his own testimony, to the governor's office. His motives remain unclear. Was it guilt? Was it ambition, hoping to save himself while destroying his rivals? Or was it compassion for Mercy, the only family member who still clung to conscience? Whatever the reason, the betrayal tore the Blackwells apart. When colonial officials raided the meeting house in October 1692, they were led directly to the hidden chamber where victims had been kept. They expected resistance. Instead, they found chaos. Shouting echoed through the underground halls as family members turned on one another. Mercy's journal claims she watched as her uncles, men who had executed neighbors without hesitation, drew blades against their own kin. One scene stands out. In her account, Uncle Josiah, the sheriff who had signed so many death warrants, cornered William with a knife. He shouted that William's treachery had doomed them all. But before the blade could fall, the governor's men stormed in. In the chaos, the Blackwells scattered into the Knight brothers, fleeing in different directions. Deputies deserting their posts and Mercy herself escaping into hiding. The betrayal did not end there. In the months that followed, rumors swirled that Ezekiel and Nathaniel plotted to silence Mercy permanently. Others said William fled south, carrying not only the truth but also the last fragments of the ledger. Trust among them had shattered. Blood ties no longer mattered. The Blackwell family had built their empire on betrayal of neighbors, friends, and the innocent. It was fitting, then, that in the end, Betrayal from within became the blade that pierced their dynasty's heart. Conspiracies thrive in silence. They grow strong in the dark, feeding on fear and secrecy. But the moment light touches them, they unravel. For the Blackwell family, that moment came in the autumn of 1692. The Salem witch trials were already faltering. Governor William Phipps, disturbed by the hysteria consuming the colony, had begun questioning the validity of spectral evidence. Clergymen whispered of misgivings, merchants complained of ruined trade, and even townsfolk once eager to condemn. Their neighbors grew uneasy at the mounting toll of executions. The climate that had once shielded the Blackwells was changing, and their enemies were sharpening knives of their own. It began quietly, with missing pages. The Blackwells infamous. Ledger meticulously detailing each stolen life, each seized property was no longer whole. Sections vanished, only to reappear in the hands of outsiders. Accusations, once directed outward toward Salem's poor and powerless, began circling inward. Rumors spread. The family itself was profiting from the very hysteria it claimed to. Opposed their power, once unchallenged, now seemed tainted with suspicion. By October, the facade cracked wide open. A raid on the meeting-house cellar exposed the hidden chambers, long whispered about rooms not used for worship, but for interrogation, confinement, and worse. Town officials, horrified by what they found, could no longer deny what many had feared. The trials were not just a spiritual purge, but a convenient smokescreen for greed. The family scrambled to contain the fallout. Ezekiel argued for silence destroy the ledger, bury the evidence, and outlast the storm. Josiah, the sheriff, insisted on brute force hang. The loudest critics and make fear do the work once again. Nathaniel, the most calculating, urged retreat abandon Salem before the tide turned completely, but they had lost control of the narrative. For years, the Blackwells had weaponized paranoia. Now paranoia consumed them. Allies became suspects, deputies defected. Even their own servants whispered that the family had made a pact with the very devil they claimed to hunt. The breaking point came in the council chamber. A surviving deposition records how local magistrates, once loyal to Blackwell authority, openly accused them of manipulating evidence, fabricating testimonies, and executing innocents for profit. The family protested, but their protests rang hollow in a town already drowning in doubt. Within weeks, the trials ended not with justice, but with silence. Records were sealed. Witnesses disappeared. And the Blackwells, once lords of Salem's terror, became fugitives of their own making. Some melted into obscurity. Others fled the colony entirely. The ledger itself was said to have been split apart, its pages scattered to prevent discovery. The conspiracy that had reshaped Salem collapsed, not because it was exposed in full, but because it could no longer sustain its own weight. Fear had carried them to power. Fear also dragged them into ruin. In the end, history remembered only fragments. 19 official executions, a few muttered rumors. The rest was buried literally and figuratively. But in the shadows of that collapse, one truth remained unshakable. The Blackwells had not been defeated by their enemies. They had been undone by their own design. Legacies are rarely buried with the bodies that created them. They linger in whispered rumors in hidden documents, in the fears of the living who sense that the past has not yet released its grip. For the Blackwell family, Salem was not the end. It was only the beginning. When the witch trials collapsed in 1692, many believed the Blackwell dynasty had been broken. Their ledger was torn apart, their power exposed, their name whispered in the same tone, one reserved for curses. Some claimed the family fled north, scattering into obscurity. Their influence shattered, but that is not the whole story, because wealth, once taken, does not simply vanish. Lands seized from victims remained in Blackwell hands, quietly transferred to cousins, loyalists and proxy owners who carried no stain of accusation. Children were sent to other colonies. Wives remarried under false names. Slowly, methodically, the Blackwells ensured that their bloodline and their fortune survived. Salem had grown too dangerous, that the world beyond offered new soil for old. Ambitions. In 1712, 2 decades after the trials, a curious entry appears in the probate records of Boston. A modest estate sale listed among its items a small leather-bound book of accounts, uncommonly detailed with notations in Latin. The auctioneer never named the seller. The buyer's name was erased. But the description matched perfectly the infamous Blackwell ledger. The book had resurfaced, not in Salem, not among magistrates or ministers, but in the hands of merchants and bankers and Boston men who traded not in souls, but in silver and land. The ledger, according to rumor, was no longer a record of past crimes. It had become a guide, a manual of sorts for manipulating fear to acquire power. If the Blackwells had vanished from Salem, their ideas had not. By the mid-1700s, whispers of the family stretched along the New England coast. A shipwreck in Maine revealed cargo registered under the Blackwell name. Land disputes in Connecticut cited ancient deeds signed by a Nathaniel Blackwell decades earlier. In Newport, Rhode Island, sailors told of a merchant family who dealt in both molasses and darker commodities. Rumors of human trafficking, cloaked beneath legitimate trade. Their coat of arms bore a striking resemblance to sketches found in the margins of the Salem ledger. Coincidence? Or continuity? The Blackwells never appeared openly in these disputes, but their shadow lingered in every record present enough to unsettle, absent enough to avoid prosecution. It was a familiar pattern, one perfected during Salem: control the narrative, act through others, and erase the evidence before questions could take root. When revolution shook the colonies in the late 1700s, many prominent families chose sides carefully. The Blackwells, predictably, thrived on the chaos. Property seizures, confiscations from loyalists, bankruptcies from wartime ruin all provided opportunity. One letter, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, recounts a chilling anecdote. A Boston tavern keeper, falling into debt, was approached by a dark-eyed gentleman of Blackwell descent who offered relief. Days later, the tavern keeper's rival was arrested for treason on the flimsiest of evidence, and the Blackwell-backed tavern flourished. The methods had not changed. Fear remained their currency, betrayal their weapon, profit their prize. By the early 1800s, records of the Blackwells drift southward. Property deeds in Virginia, plantation records in the Carolinas, and even whispers in Louisiana suggest that the family adapted to the new economy of slavery and cotton. Here, the pattern grew darker still. Local legends in Charleston tell of a house on Meeting Street owned by a Mr. Blackwell, where slaves were branded not only with iron but with strange sigils carved into wood above the cellar doors. Echoes of the secret chambers beneath. Salem's meeting house. To neighbors, the Blackwells were respectable planters and businessmen. But to the enslaved, they were demons in human guise. Stories spoke of disappearances, of bargains sealed in blood, of families torn apart for reasons that had nothing to do with work quotas or punishment. The Salem legacy, the use of fear to justify possession, had found fertile ground in America's most brutal institution. The Civil War should have ended them. Plantation fortunes crumbled, old names died out, records burned. And indeed, many historians list the Blackwells as extinct by 1870, but extinction is a word the family had. Cheated before. In 1872, a small article appeared in a New York paper, describing the trial of a banker accused of fraud. Among the evidence presented was a moldering leather journal of Salem origin, annotated through successive generations, detailing practices best left unnamed. The court dismissed it as irrelevant. The banker walked free. The ledger, once again, had returned past. Down like a sacred relic. As America modernized, so too did the methods of exploitation. Where once the Blackwells had seized farms and taverns, now they whispered through boardrooms and banks. In the 1920s. During Prohibition, federal agents raided a warehouse in Providence. Hidden among crates of Canadian whiskey, they found an altar-like table etched with the Blackwell crest. The papers reported it as a curiosity. The agents who discovered it refused to speak of what else they found. By the 1960s, conspiracy theorists began connecting dots. A series of unsolved disappearances in Massachusetts. Land bought up quietly along the coast by shell companies. a law firm named Blackwell and Sons representing interests, so old their origins could not be traced. Some dismissed it all as coincidence. Others claimed the family had survived by never appearing in public records operating, instead as ghosts behind other names, always careful, always hidden. What then is the Blackwell legacy? Is it the blood spilled in Salem? The ledger of death, passed down like an heirloom? Or is it something more insidious, an idea that outlives any single name? The idea that fear can be a weapon. That accusation can enrich the accuser. That human lives can be reduced to entries in a book, neat lines of profit and loss. This is the true inheritance of the Blackwells. Not merely land or silver, but a philosophy, a system of manipulation refined over centuries, and perhaps that is why, even today, the name still surfaces. A Blackwell Foundation funding real estate projects in Boston. A Blackwell Corporation registered in Delaware. A Blackwell attorney handling estates that date back farther than any living memory should allow, coincidence or continuity. One final. Rumor remains. In 2018, a church in Salem undergoing restoration revealed a hidden compartment beneath its floorboards. Inside were fragments of a book, water damaged, ink smeared, but legible enough to confirm what some had long suspected. The Blackwell ledger had never been fully destroyed. On its last surviving page was an unfinished entry, a name half written, a blank space waiting for completion. Was it meant for Mercy Blackwell, betrayed by her cousin and lost to history? Or was it meant for someone yet to come? The book, according to archivists, disappeared within weeks of its discovery. Officially, it was misplaced during cataloging. Unofficially, no one is willing to speak about it. The ledger is missing once more. And the Blackwell story remains unfinished. The Salem witch trials ended centuries ago. But the Blackwell family shadow stretches across time, proof that some legacies do not die. They adapt. And perhaps, somewhere in the quiet halls of power, in boardrooms or law offices, someone still dips a quill now, a pen into ink, ready to add another line to a book that should have burned long ago. The Blackwell family did not vanish. They evolved. And their story is not over. History rarely ends with clarity. It ends with silence, with missing pages, with burned documents, with names half-scratched out of ledgers that should have told the whole truth but never did. And the Blackwell story is no different. We have followed them from Salem, shadowed gallows, through the secret deals of Boston merchants, into the plantations of the South and the boardrooms of modern America. What began as whispers of witchcraft became a system of chilling philosophy that outlived every rope, every trial, every execution. The ledger may be missing, but its fingerprints are still here. So the question becomes, what do we do with this knowledge? Do we accept the official version that the Blackwells faded into obscurity, just another forgotten family name swallowed by time? Or do we confront the darker possibility that their legacy never ended at all? Because when you trace patterns of power across history, the sudden disappearances, the convenient accusations, the property seizures dressed as justice, you start to notice how familiar it all feels. The stage may have changed. The costumes may look different, but the performance has stayed the same. This isn't just a story about Salem, it's about the human condition. The Blackwells remind us how fear can be weaponized, how entire communities can be manipulated by whispers, how human lives can be reduced to nothing more than opportunity for those hungry enough to seize them. And if we are honest, that story has repeated itself over and over, not just in 1692, not just in colonial America, but in boardrooms and courtrooms, in governments across the world today. The question is not whether the Blackwells survived. The question is whether their method survived, and deep down, you already know the answer. But here's where the past becomes personal, because you, watching this now, are part of how this story continues. Do you believe the ledger was destroyed? Or do you believe it still exists, passed down from hand to hand, generation to generation? Do you believe the Blackwells died out? Or do you believe their influence simply changed form, hiding in plain sight? And perhaps most importantly, what would you do if the ledger surfaced again? Would you want to read it? Or would you be too afraid of what you might find? The Blackwell legacy lingers not just in the pages of history, but in our imagination where truth and fear collide, and maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what the Blackwells wanted, to live on, not through flesh and blood, but through the terror of being remembered. Their story is unfinished, and now it belongs to you. If you've stayed with me this far, tell me, do you think the Blackwell family truly vanished? Or are they still out there, waiting for their ledger to be complete? Leave your thoughts below, and let's see how far this shadow really stretches.